The cowboy whispered, "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out." Wild West story. His horse's hooves kicked up clouds of pale brown dust, and every step seemed to echo against the quiet wooden buildings that lined the main street. Ethan had been traveling for days, following the winding trails of the Wild West, seeking a place to rest, work, and maybe find a reason to stay. His boots were worn, his hat was faded, and his eyes carried the tiredness of someone who had seen too much of the world already, even at a young age. The town looked deserted at first, but as he guided his horse closer, he noticed the few people who dared move in the blistering heat. A woman hung laundry on a line outside a small wooden house, her face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. Children peeked from behind doors, their eyes wide with curiosity, and a man repaired a broken wagon wheel in front of a blacksmith shop, stopping only to give Ethan a wary glance. There was something in the air that made Ethan tense. He had been in towns like this before, and he knew the rule. In the West, appearances could be deceiving. A quiet street could hide a storm. Ethan dismounted and adjusted his hat, brushing the dust from his coat. The horse nickered softly, as if sensing the tension in the town, but Ethan had no choice but to move forward. He tied the reins to a post in front of a small saloon. Its windows were dusty, and the swinging doors creaked as they moved in the wind. The sound made Ethan's stomach tighten. He had heard stories of saloon fights, of men losing more than just their money over a wrong word or a poorly aimed glance. He hesitated for a moment but knew he needed information. Inside, the saloon was dim and smelled of tobacco, wood, and the faint sourness of spilled whiskey. A few men were scattered around the room, some playing cards at a table in the corner, others simply watching the door as if expecting trouble to walk in at any second. The bartender, a tall man with a thin mustache and eyes that seemed too sharp for comfort, watched Ethan carefully. Ethan ordered water, keeping his voice calm, and tried to appear confident. He had learned that in towns like these, confidence was as valuable as a gun. If a man looked unsure, he was an easy target. As he sipped, his eyes scanned the room, noting exits, shadows, and faces. His instincts told him that this town, though small, was controlled by people who valued power over kindness. A sudden crash made him turn. A man had shoved another off a chair, and fists began to fly. The fight was quick and violent, leaving the second man sprawled on the floor, groaning. Ethan realized that even small towns like Dry Creek could be dangerous, and survival required more than just caution. It required understanding the rules of life and death here. It was then that Ethan noticed a figure leaning against the far wall, watching the fight with a quiet, calm expression. The man was older, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to see everything. His hat was tilted back slightly, and his coat had the worn look of someone who spent most of his life on the open plains. Ethan felt drawn to him, sensing a presence that commanded respect without raising a voice. After the brawl ended, Ethan approached the man cautiously. "Name S. Ethan Parker," he said, offering his hand, though he was unsure if this man would shake it. The older man studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Silas Crawford," he said, voice low but steady. "You're new here." "I'm looking for work," Ethan said honestly. "I can ride, handle a gun, do just about anything a man needs." Silas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Ethan's hands, his boots, the dust on his coat. There was a silence that felt heavier than the fight that had just happened. Finally, Silas spoke. "You'll need more than that to survive in a place like this. Out here, it ain't just about what you can do, it's about knowing when to do it, and knowing when not to." Ethan listened carefully. He had heard similar warnings before, but there was something in Silas's tone that made the words feel different, like they carried the weight of years spent in the unforgiving Wild West. Silas's eyes moved toward the door. "You see that street?" he asked. "By sundown, every man and woman walking that road will have a story. Some of them will be good, some will be bad. You learn to read them or you won't last long. Ethan nodded. He wanted to ask more questions, but something told him to wait. There was value in watching first, asking later. Silas seemed to understand that. Without another word, he turned and left the saloon, and Ethan followed. Outside, the air was hotter, heavier, but he felt a strange sense of purpose. For the first time in days, he wasn't just wandering. He was learning. Silas led him through the town, pointing out the blacksmith, the general store, the sheriff's office, and the little schoolhouse where children laughed despite the harshness around them. Every place has its danger, Silas said. Even a schoolhouse. A man with a grudge can hide anywhere. Ethan tried to memorize the details, understanding that knowledge here was as crucial as a loaded gun. As the afternoon wore on, Silas took Ethan to the outskirts of town, where the plain stretched wide and open. The wind moved freely here, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faint tang of livestock. Silas mounted his horse and motioned for Ethan to follow. Riding across the plains was different from riding in towns. Here, there were no walls to hide behind, no narrow streets to navigate. Every sound, every movement mattered. Out here, you learn patience, Silas said. You wait, you watch, you breathe. Sometimes holding on is the only skill that keeps a man alive. Ethan listened, soaking in every word. He had always thought survival meant being quick on your feet, faster on the draw, stronger than the rest. But Silas was teaching him something different. It was about stillness, about endurance, about understanding the world and your place in it before it crushed you. As the sun began to sink behind the distant hills, they came across a small herd of cattle. Silas dismounted quietly, motioning for Ethan to do the same. "See them?" he whispered. "You move too fast, spook them, and they're gone. You move too slow and something else might catch you first. Balance, son. That's what we're learning here." Ethan moved as Silas instructed, careful with every step. It was hard to imagine how such patience could matter in a town full of gunfights and brawls, but he trusted Silas's experience. By the time they returned to Dry Creek, Ethan felt different. He was tired, yes, but also alert in a way he hadn't been before. He had begun to understand that the Wild West didn't forgive mistakes, but it rewarded caution, thoughtfulness, and endurance. Back in the town, they returned to the saloon, where Ethan finally allowed himself a moment to rest. He sipped water again, but this time he noticed the way people looked at him differently. Perhaps it was Silas's presence, or maybe it was the way Ethan's posture had changed, no longer that of a wandering drifter, but of someone learning to survive. "Tomorrow," Silas said as they sat in silence, "we ride again. You'll face things you didn't expect. And you'll have to remember one thing, no matter what happens, you're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out. That's the first lesson of the West." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of those words. Life in Dry Creek and the plains beyond was not for the faint of heart, but for the first time in weeks he felt ready. The sun disappeared behind the hills, casting long shadows across the town, and Ethan knew that this was only the beginning. He had arrived in a land where every breath mattered, every moment was a test, and survival depended on more than just skill. It depended on patience, courage, and learning to endure until the very end. As night fell and the town settled into a quiet rhythm, Ethan lay under the stars, listening to the distant howls of coyotes and the whisper of the wind. The Wild West was harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but it was also alive, full of lessons for those willing to learn. And Ethan Parker, weary but determined, had already taken his first step toward becoming more than just a drifter. He was learning to survive. He was learning to endure. And with Silas's guidance, he would learn that every moment, every breath, was a chance to live another day in the untamed, wild, and beautiful land he now called home. The next morning, the sun rose over Dry Creek like a golden promise, painting the dusty streets and wood buildings in warm light. Ethan Parker woke early, the memory of Silas's words echoing in his mind. "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out." They were not just words. They were a warning, a lesson, and a lifeline all in one. Today, he would begin his first real training under Silas, and he knew it would be harder than anything he had faced before. Silas was already outside, tending to his horse. The old cowboy moved with calm precision, brushing the animal's coat, checking the saddle, and adjusting the reins. When he saw Ethan, he gave a nod. "Ready?" he asked. Ethan swallowed, trying to hide his nerves. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied. Silas didn't answer. He simply gestured for Ethan to mount his horse, and together they set off toward the open plains beyond the town. The ride was quiet at first. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts about the town, the people, and the dangers that lurked in every shadow. Silas, on the other hand, rode with steady calm, eyes scanning the horizon, alert to every movement. Ethan realized quickly that part of surviving in the West was not just knowing how to ride or shoot. It was knowing how to watch, how to listen, and how to anticipate what might happen next. After some time, Silas stopped near a small cluster of trees that broke the endless stretch of plains. "Here," he said, dismounting and gesturing for Ethan to do the same. "This is where you start learning to be invisible, not literally, of course. But in a fight, in a chase, in life, you have to know when to move, when to stay still, and how to make yourself small without anyone noticing. You ready for that?" Ethan nodded, though his stomach tightened. It sounded simple in theory, but he knew that the practice would be far from easy. Silas handed him a blanket and pointed to a spot behind a tree. "Lie down. Watch. Listen. Don't move unless I say. You'll learn to survive by patience, not force." Ethan obeyed, lowering himself to the dry grass. The sun was warm on his back and the wind whispered through the trees. At first, there was nothing to see but the wide-open plains, the distant hills, and the occasional bird flying overhead. But Silas had taught him to pay attention. Slowly, Ethan began to notice the small details, the flicker of movement near the horizon, the faint shadow of a coyote weaving through the tall grass, the sudden rustle that might mean a snake or something larger. Hours passed like this, silent and tense. Ethan's legs ached, his back burned from lying on the rough ground, and his mind fought the urge to move. But he stayed still, focused on every sound, every shadow. Silas never moved either. He simply watched Ethan, allowing the young man to learn on his own while offering guidance when needed. By mid-afternoon, Silas finally spoke. "You did well. Most men can't stay still that long without panicking. But patience, observation, and control, those are your strongest tools. In the West, a man who panics dies." Ethan breathed a sigh of relief, but the lesson was far from over. Silas mounted his horse and motioned for Ethan to follow. "Now you ride again. But this time we'll face something real, something dangerous. You'll have to use what you just learned." The two rode deeper into the plains, where the land rose and fell in gentle hills. The wind carried the smell of sagebrush, dry soil, and distant water. Ethan's heart beat faster as he realized Silas was taking him to a place where survival was not a lesson, it was practice. Soon, the sound of galloping hooves reached them from behind a distant ridge. Silas slowed his horse and pointed. "See that? Outlaws, bandits. They like to hunt travelers for fun or sometimes for profit. Today, you'll learn what it's like to face a threat you can't avoid." Ethan's stomach twisted, fear rising like a storm inside him. But he remembered Silas's words: "Stay calm, observe, endure." Silas dismounted and whispered instructions. "You stay low behind the hill, watch them, learn their movements, wait for my signal, panicking will get you killed." The bandits appeared over the ridge, 3 men on horseback, faces covered with dust and scarves. They rode fast, scanning the plains, laughing and shouting threats. Ethan crouched behind the hill, heart pounding, sweat on his brow. He noticed how they moved, how their horses reacted, how they communicated with quick gestures and sharp words. Silas watched too, calm and silent, a rock in the middle of chaos. The bandits approached closer. Ethan could see one dismount, examining the ground as if searching for tracks. Another leaned low over his horse, scanning the horizon. Ethan remembered Silas's lesson: observe everything, react only when necessary. He stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe, though his chest felt tight and heavy. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. Ethan realized that surviving the West was as much about mental endurance as physical skill. The bandits continued their patrol, unaware of Ethan and Silas watching them from the hill. Then, as if by chance, the lead bandit noticed something, a glint of metal near the tree where Ethan had lain before. His hand moved toward his gun, and Ethan felt his heart leap. Silas whispered sharply, "Hold on, don't move, wait." Ethan froze, every muscle tense. The bandit scanned the area carefully, but eventually he shrugged and mounted his horse again, riding off with the others. Ethan exhaled, relief flooding him, but he also felt a strange thrill. He had survived his first real test, and he understood the truth of Silas's words. "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out." As they rode back to Dry Creek, Silas spoke, his voice calm but firm. Most men would have panicked, made noise, or tried to run. You stayed calm, you observed. That's the first step in learning to survive. But remember, danger is everywhere, and it can appear when you least expect it. Out here, every breath counts. Every decision matters. Ethan nodded, trying to absorb every word. He felt changed somehow, as if the plains themselves had passed a lesson through him. His confidence grew, but so did his respect for the land and the people who lived by its rules. He realized that survival was not about being the strongest, fastest, or most aggressive. It was about patience, observation, and the ability to endure. Over the next few days, Silas continued the training. They rode long distances, sometimes for hours without seeing another soul. Silas taught Ethan how to find water in the desert, how to read tracks left by animals or men, how to recognize signs of danger in the wind and the clouds. Each lesson was designed not just to teach skill, but to teach endurance, patience, and awareness. One evening, as they camped under the stars, Silas pointed to the sky. "See those stars? Out here, they're the only map you have at night. You follow them wrong, you're lost. You make one mistake in judgment, and it could be your last. This is the West, Ethan. It's beautiful, but it doesn't forgive. You learn fast, or you don't learn at all." Ethan felt the weight of the wilderness pressing down on him, but it also filled him with awe. The vast plains, the endless sky, and the quiet strength of his mentor showed him that life in the West was not just about surviving attacks or gunfights. It was about understanding the world around you, respecting it, and moving through it with caution and awareness. One night during a particularly harsh storm, Ethan experienced the most difficult lesson yet. Lightning flashed across the sky, and thunder rattled the ground. Their small tent offered little protection from the wind and rain, and Ethan shivered in his thin coat. He wanted to panic, to run to the nearest shelter in town, but Silas's voice came to him clearly in his mind. "Hold on until your breath runs out." He forced himself to breathe slowly, to focus on what he could control: securing the tent, keeping the fire from going out, making sure the horses were safe. By the time the storm passed, Ethan realized he had survived yet another test. The West was teaching him that survival was a combination of courage, skill, and mental endurance. By the end of the week, Ethan was no longer the nervous drifter who had arrived in Dry Creek. He had learned to ride with confidence, observe with precision, and endure the hardships of the plains. Silas's teachings were slowly sinking in, shaping him into someone who could survive, not just exist. On the final evening of that week, Silas and Ethan sat outside the saloon, watching the sunset paint the town in shades of orange and red. Silas handed Ethan a canteen of water and said, "You did well, son. But remember, this is only the beginning." Out here, danger comes in many forms. Bandits, storms, accidents. Even a careless word can cost you your life. But if you keep your wits, stay patient, and remember that each breath is a chance to live, you'll make it. Ethan nodded, feeling a deep sense of pride mixed with caution. The Wild West was harsh, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but he was learning its rules. With Silas guiding him, he understood that survival was more than skill. It was endurance, patience, and the will to hold on until the very end. As night fell over Dry Creek, Ethan lay under the stars again, thinking about the day's lessons and the ones yet to come. He knew that challenges would only grow, but he also knew he was no longer unprepared. Each moment, each breath, each decision mattered, and as he drifted off to sleep, the words of his mentor echoed in his mind, steady and unwavering. "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out." The days after Ethan's first lessons with Silas passed quickly, each one blending into the next with long rides across the plains, careful observation of the land, and patient learning. Dry Creek had begun to feel less like a strange town and more like a place where survival was not just possible but attainable, for those who paid attention, endured, and respected the rules. Ethan's confidence grew, yet he also understood that confidence alone could be dangerous in the Wild West. It was mid-morning when Silas spotted trouble on the horizon. Three figures on horseback were approaching the outskirts of the town. At first, Ethan thought they might be travelers, but Silas's sharp eyes caught every detail: their posture, the way they held their weapons, the subtle signs of intent. He nudged Ethan to a stop behind a ridge, motioning for him to stay low. "Outlaws," Silas said quietly. "They're looking for trouble or someone to rob, could be both. Stay calm, observe, and follow my lead. Remember what you've learned, patience and awareness. Don't act unless I tell you to." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had watched the bandits from a distance before, but this was different. They were closer, and now they could see him if he made a single mistake. The young man's hands trembled slightly, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, focusing on each detail. The first outlaw's horse was strong and steady, the man's face covered with a scarf. The second was younger, impatient, constantly glancing around. The third carried a rifle loosely in his hand, ready for any sign of weakness. Silas signaled Ethan to follow him along a narrow path that twisted through sparse trees and low hills. They stayed out of sight, moving carefully, silently, as the outlaws drew nearer to the town. Ethan felt the tension like a physical weight pressing on his chest. Every step mattered, every sound, every shadow could give them away. When they reached a small rise, Silas stopped. "We need to see what they want," he whispered. "Patience, Ethan. Let them reveal themselves. Don't make a move yet." From their vantage point, Ethan watched the outlaws as they rode into Dry Creek, eyeing the town suspiciously. They dismounted near the saloon, their boots kicking up dust, and began speaking to the bartender and a few townspeople. The conversation was tense, full of sharp gestures and brief, angry words. Ethan noticed the fear in the townspeople's faces, the subtle way they tried to avoid eye contact, the quiet surrender of men and women used to violence. Silas turned to Ethan. "See that? They're testing the town, seeing who's weak, who will fight back, and who will hide. You learn from this. Watch their movements, note their patterns. Every decision they make tells a story. That story will help you survive." Hours passed as the outlaws inspected the town, their presence a constant, growing threat. Ethan began to understand that danger wasn't always immediate. It could be slow, creeping, and invisible until it struck. Silas had prepared him for the physical skills of survival, but now Ethan was learning the mental side, reading people, predicting behavior, and staying calm under pressure. Late that afternoon, the tension finally erupted. One of the outlaws tried to intimidate the sheriff, a tall man with a graying beard who had been watching the confrontation closely. Words were exchanged, sharp and full of anger, until the outlaw shoved the sheriff back. The situation escalated quickly. Chairs were thrown, and the air was filled with shouts and the clash of fists. Ethan felt his pulse race. This was his first real test in a confrontation, and he knew that any mistake could be dangerous. Silas leaned close. "Remember, stay calm. Observe, use your head, not your fists. If you panic, you'll get hurt. If you stay patient, you might survive." Ethan nodded, gripping his hat tightly, trying to steady his shaking hands. He watched as the young outlaw who had been leaning aggressively against the sheriff was distracted by a loose plank on the saloon's floor. Ethan noticed it before anyone else and whispered to himself, "Hold on, stay steady." The outlaw tripped, giving the sheriff a chance to regain control. The fight didn't end completely, but the tide shifted. Observation and patience had given Ethan a small advantage, a reminder that survival wasn't about immediate strength, but careful timing. By sunset, the outlaws had left the town, though the tension lingered like smoke. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and exhilaration. He had witnessed real danger, but he had stayed calm, observed carefully, and even influenced the outcome without a single reckless move. Silas clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good today," Silas said. "Most young men would have frozen or run. You stayed steady. That's a start. But remember, this isn't over. Danger will come again, and next time it may not be avoidable. You'll have to be ready." Over the next few days, Ethan practiced more under Silas's guidance. They rode at dawn, practiced tracking, and even worked on quick-thinking exercises. Silas would stage scenarios where Ethan had to make split-second decisions, whether to hide, run, or confront a threat. Each time, Ethan learned to trust his instincts while staying grounded in observation and patience. One afternoon, Silas took Ethan to a narrow canyon outside of Dry Creek. "You're going to learn what it feels like when a threat is real and unavoidable," he said. Ethan's stomach tightened, fear mingling with anticipation. Silas explained that they would simulate a situation where outlaws were approaching from both sides, and Ethan would need to decide quickly what to do. As they waited, the wind whistled through the canyon, carrying the scent of dry earth and sage. Shadows lengthened as the sun dipped toward the horizon, making the narrow canyon feel even more confining. Ethan's heart pounded, but he remembered Silas's lessons: observe, breathe, endure. When the outlaws appeared over the ridge, Ethan could see them clearly this time. Their faces were stern, their hands near their weapons. He stayed crouched, watching carefully. Silas whispered instructions, guiding him without directly intervening. Ethan realized that his training had changed him. He could anticipate movements, read body language, and understand intent in a way he hadn't before. The confrontation tested everything Ethan had learned. One outlaw aimed a gun at Silas, and instinctively Ethan shouted a warning and took cover. Silas moved swiftly, redirecting the attention of the attackers. Ethan stayed low, watching, waiting for the moment to act. Then a sudden noise. Another bandit approaching from behind could have ended disastrously. Ethan remembered the mantra, "Hold on until your breath runs out." He stayed calm, positioned himself strategically, and when the moment was right, acted decisively, helping Silas create an opening for escape. By the time the sun disappeared completely behind the hills, the outlaws had retreated. Ethan's body shook with adrenaline, exhaustion, and relief. Silas looked at him, expression unreadable at first, then a small smile appeared. "You kept your head," Silas said. "You didn't panic and you stayed aware. That's how you survive out here." Not every fight is about bullets. Sometimes it's about patience, timing, and staying alive long enough to make the right move. Ethan felt a deep sense of pride. He had faced real danger, not as a bystander, but as someone who had contributed to survival. The Wild West was harsh, but he was learning that with patience, observation, and courage, even the most threatening situations could be navigated. The following days in Dry Creek were quieter, but Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before more challenges came. He continued to watch the town, learning about its people, the outlaws' patterns, and how small actions could influence survival. He realized that life in the West was a constant test, not of strength alone, but of endurance, patience, and mental skill. One evening, as Ethan and Silas sat outside the saloon, watching the town settle into quiet, Silas spoke again. "Ethan, you're learning fast, but never forget this. Outlaws, danger, storms, they all test you. Every moment you stay calm, every breath you take, you're learning to survive. Remember, you're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out. That's the lesson that will keep you alive longer than any gun or horse." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of the words. He had faced his first real confrontation, survived, and learned that the Wild West demanded more than courage. It demanded endurance, awareness, and a calm mind in the face of danger. By the time night fell over Dry Creek, Ethan was no longer just a young man learning to survive. He had begun to understand the rhythm of the West, the balance of patience, observation, and timing. He knew that challenges would continue, that the next encounter might be more dangerous, but he also knew that he had learned the most important lesson. Survival depended on keeping your head, using your senses, and enduring until the very end. Ethan lay under the stars, listening to the distant howl of coyotes and the whisper of the wind through the plains. He felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The West was harsh, unforgiving, and wild, but it was also full of lessons for those willing to learn. And Ethan Parker, once a nervous drifter, was beginning to become someone who could face danger, endure, and survive, just as Silas had promised he could. The days after the last confrontation passed with a tense quiet. Dry Creek seemed peaceful, but Ethan Parker knew better. In the Wild West, peace was often just a pause before the storm. He had learned patience, observation, and mental endurance under Silas's careful guidance, but nothing could fully prepare him for what was coming. It started one early morning. Ethan was riding with Silas along the outskirts of town, checking the fences and water sources for the horses, when they noticed unusual tracks in the soft earth. Silas knelt, examining the prints carefully. "These aren't normal travelers," he murmured. "Looks like the same gang that's been causing trouble around here. They're close, maybe watching the town." Ethan's heart sank. The thought of facing the outlaws again made his stomach tighten, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, focusing on what he had learned: patience, observation, and keeping calm under pressure. Silas noticed his tension and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry yet. We watch, we learn, we plan. Panic gets no one anywhere." By mid-afternoon, news reached them that the gang had kidnapped a local farmer's son. The town was in chaos and fear gripped every heart. Ethan felt anger and fear surge inside him, but he remembered Silas's lessons. This wasn't about rash decisions. It was about strategy and survival. He could help, but only if he stayed focused. Silas led Ethan to a ridge overlooking the valley where the gang had set up a temporary camp. From their vantage point, they could see the outlaws laughing and talking, the boy tied to a post near a small shack. Ethan's pulse raced, but he stayed low behind the rocks. He could see every detail: the number of outlaws, their positions, the horses, and the surrounding terrain. Silas's eyes never left the camp. "This is it," Silas said quietly. "You have two choices: rush in recklessly and risk everything, or watch, wait, and act when the moment is right. Remember what I told you: hold on until your breath runs out. You survive by patience and timing, not by rushing into danger." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He could see the boy struggling, fear clear in his eyes. The gang was careless, laughing and showing off their weapons, unaware that they were being watched. Ethan realized that this was a moment where observation could save a life. Silas pointed to a small path on the far side of the camp. "We'll use that. Move quietly, follow my lead, and keep your eyes open. One wrong step, one noise too loud, and it could all be over." Ethan moved as silently as possible, muscles tense, heart pounding. Every sound, the crunch of a stone, the rustle of the grass, the distant wind, was magnified in his mind. He had never felt so alert in his life. Silas moved ahead, leading the way, showing Ethan how to stay invisible while positioning themselves for a safe approach. As they neared the camp, Ethan realized just how much he had learned from the past weeks. He could read the outlaws' body language, predict their movements, and find cover without hesitation. The hours of observation and practice had prepared him for this exact moment, but the fear was still there. He clenched his fists and focused on his breathing, recalling Silas's words. Suddenly, one of the outlaws turned, looking directly in their direction. Ethan froze, barely daring to breathe. Silas whispered sharply, "Stay calm, don't move." "Watch." The outlaw's gaze lingered for a moment, then he shrugged and turned back. Ethan exhaled silently, relief washing over him. One small victory, but it reminded him how close danger always was. When they were close enough, Silas signaled Ethan to move to the left side of the camp, closer to the shack where the boy was tied. Ethan followed carefully, every step calculated. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He had never felt so alive, yet so aware of how easily a mistake could cost a life. The plan was simple but required precision. Silas would distract the outlaws while Ethan cut the ropes and freed the boy. Ethan's hands shook as he pulled a small knife from his belt, but he focused on the task at hand. He moved to the shack, ducked behind a crate, and silently cut the ropes binding the boy's hands. The boy's eyes widened, fear still evident, but he nodded in understanding. Silas created a diversion, shouting and throwing small stones to draw the outlaws' attention. Ethan seized the moment, signaling the boy to follow him quietly. They moved together, staying low and silent, every sense heightened. The outlaws noticed something amiss and started looking around, but Silas's distraction gave them precious seconds. Ethan and the boy reached cover behind a line of rocks. The boy trembled and Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "It's okay. Stay quiet. Follow me and we'll get out of here." The boy nodded, courage growing despite fear. The outlaws realized the boy was missing and began searching frantically. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he stayed calm, remembering every lesson Silas had taught him. Observation, patience, and timing were his allies. One false move and they could be discovered. He scanned the area, noting the position of each outlaw and planned their next step. They needed to move across an open space to reach safety, and Ethan knew it would be dangerous. Silas appeared again, creating another distraction. Ethan counted the moments, waited for the right instant, and then ran with the boy, ducking behind every available cover. Bullets whizzed past, thudding into the earth around them. Fear surged, but Ethan forced himself to stay calm, to breathe steadily, and to focus on every detail. By the time they reached a hidden path that led back toward Dry Creek, Ethan felt a mix of exhaustion, adrenaline, and relief. The boy was safe, and the outlaws were too far behind to follow immediately. Silas met them at the edge of the path, a proud look in his eyes. "You did well, Ethan," Silas said. "You stayed calm under pressure, you observed, and you acted when the time was right. That's how you survive in this land, not by rushing in blindly, but by using your mind and keeping your heart steady." Ethan felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had faced real danger, made life-or-death decisions, and survived. He realized that survival in the Wild West was not just about physical skill or courage. It was about endurance, patience, and the ability to hold on until the very end. The town of Dry Creek greeted them with cautious relief as they returned with the boy. People whispered about the bravery of the young man who had helped save the boy, but Ethan felt little pride. What mattered to him was the knowledge that he had survived. that he had done what was necessary, and that he had learned another crucial lesson about the harsh realities of life in the West. Over the next few days, Ethan continued his training with Silas, but now with a new perspective. He understood that danger could appear at any moment, and that every choice, every breath, could be the difference between life and death. Silas introduced more advanced skills, reading terrain for ambushes, predicting the movements of others, and using the environment to their advantage. Each exercise reinforced the lesson Ethan had learned during the rescue. Calm observation and precise action were more powerful than raw strength. One evening, as they sat around a small campfire, Silas spoke about the importance of mental endurance. "Ethan," he said, "this land will test you every day. Some days it's the outlaws, some days it's the weather, some days it's the choices you make. But remember this, if you can keep your mind steady and your eyes open, you'll survive where others fall." That's the power of patience and awareness. Ethan listened carefully, the firelight flickering across his tired but determined face. He understood now that his training was more than skill building. It was shaping him into a person who could face the unpredictable, dangerous, and wild world of the West and endure. The weeks that followed brought more challenges, small at first but growing steadily. Ethan faced storms, navigated difficult terrain, and helped townspeople handle minor disputes. Each experience tested his skills and patience, reinforcing the lessons from the rescue. The mantra Silas had repeated countless times echoed in his mind. "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out." Ethan began to notice changes in himself. He moved with more confidence, read situations more clearly, and felt a growing sense of calm even in tense moments. The Wild West was still dangerous, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but he no longer felt like a helpless drifter. He was becoming a survivor, someone capable of facing threats, making decisions under pressure, and enduring whatever challenges the land and its people could throw at him. One night, as he lay under the stars beside the campfire, Ethan reflected on the events of the past weeks. He had faced real danger, learned to stay calm under pressure, and discovered the importance of observation, patience, and timing. He understood now that survival was not just about strength or speed. It was about endurance, awareness, and the will to hold on until the very end. Silas, sitting nearby, watched Ethan quietly. "You've come a long way, son," he said softly. "But remember, the West always has another test waiting. You survived today, and that's what matters. But the next challenge will be just as hard, maybe harder. Keep your mind sharp, your heart steady, and your breath calm. That's how you live and survive." Ethan nodded, feeling a deep sense of resolve. He was ready for the challenges ahead. The Wild West was harsh, full of danger and uncertainty, but he was no longer unprepared. With patience, observation, and endurance, he knew he could face whatever came next and survive. As the fire burned low and the stars shone brightly above, Ethan Parker realized that life in the West was a constant test, and he had passed his first real one. The lessons of patience, courage, and endurance would carry him forward, preparing him for the battles yet to come. And through it all, he would remember the most important lesson Silas had taught him. "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out." The weeks after the daring rescue passed in a mix of quiet reflection and continued vigilance. Dry Creek had returned to its usual rhythm, but Ethan Parker knew the calm was fragile. The Wild West was never truly peaceful. The dust and wind carried whispers of danger, and every day held the potential for a new test. Yet, Ethan felt a shift within himself. He was no longer the nervous drifter who had first arrived in town. The lessons from Silas, the brushes with danger, and the moments where patience and observation had saved him, had forged him into someone stronger, someone ready for what lay ahead. Ethan spent his mornings riding the open plains, checking on the town's livestock, scouting the edges of Dry Creek, and refining the skills Silas had taught him. Each day he noticed more details: the subtle movements of horses in the corral, the quiet signals exchanged between townspeople, the tracks left in the dirt that told stories of strangers passing by. The world seemed sharper, clearer, and yet more dangerous. Ethan understood now that survival depended on awareness as much as courage. Silas often joined him on these rides, their horses moving side by side across the golden expanse of the plains. "You've learned a lot," Silas said one morning, his voice calm as always. "But the real test isn't just outlaws or storms. The real test is living with what you've learned. It's about making the right decisions when no one is watching, staying steady when the world tries to shake you, and knowing that every choice can matter." Ethan nodded, thinking about the boy they had rescued, the moments of danger they had faced, and the countless small lessons that had shaped him over the past weeks. He realized that survival was not a single act of courage, but a series of steady, thoughtful decisions made one after another. The mantra Silas had repeated countless times came to mind again: "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out." It had become more than words. It was a guide, a way to approach life itself. One afternoon, while riding near the edge of the town, Ethan noticed a group of travelers approaching. Their horses were tired, and their expressions carried both caution and curiosity. Ethan recognized the signs immediately. Strangers entering a small, tight-knit town would draw attention, and every movement could be scrutinized. He signaled Silas, and together they observed from a distance, watching the newcomers carefully. The travelers stopped near the general store, asking for directions and supplies. Ethan noted their body language, the way they spoke, and how they interacted with the townspeople. Unlike the outlaws, there was no threat here, only curiosity and the desire to pass through safely. Yet Ethan understood the lesson. Not every encounter required fear, but every encounter required awareness. He could see the world in shades of caution and opportunity, danger and safety, all at the same time. Over the following days, Ethan continued to grow in confidence and skill. He helped the townspeople with their daily tasks, guided travelers safely through the outskirts, and even assisted in minor disputes with calm reasoning rather than aggression. People began to notice his steady presence, the quiet confidence he carried, and the careful way he handled challenges. Dry Creek started to see him not just as a newcomer, but as someone reliable, capable, and wise beyond his years. Yet Ethan never forgot the lessons of the plains. One evening, as he rode toward the ridge overlooking the town, he spotted smoke rising in the distance. His heart tightened. It could mean danger, fire, or trouble. Silas appeared at his side, and together they rode toward the source. They found a small barn on the outskirts of town ablaze, the flames threatening nearby structures. Without hesitation, Ethan acted. He helped the townspeople form a bucket chain, carrying water from a nearby well to the fire. He remained calm under pressure, giving instructions where needed and staying aware of the shifting danger as the flames crackled and smoke filled the air. Silas observed silently, a faint smile playing on his lips. Ethan's training had prepared him not just for confrontations with outlaws, but for moments like this, where patience, observation, and calm action mattered most. By the time the fire was under control, the barn was damaged but the nearby buildings were safe, and no one was hurt. Ethan felt a sense of relief and quiet pride. This was a different kind of danger, but it required the same lessons he had learned over the past weeks: patience, awareness, endurance, and the ability to stay calm under pressure. As the sun set over Dry Creek, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Ethan and Silas sat on a nearby hill, looking down at the town. The wind carried the scent of smoke and sage, and the quiet of the plains stretched endlessly before them. Silas spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "You've come a long way, Ethan. You've faced danger, made decisions that saved lives, and learned to endure. But the most important thing you've learned is this: survival isn't about winning every fight or being the strongest. It's about keeping your head, staying calm, and holding on when everything seems impossible. You've done that. You've proven yourself. Ethan looked out at the town, feeling a mix of pride and humility. He thought about the boy they had rescued, the outlaws, the storms, and the fires. He realized that the Wild West was not just a place of danger and struggle, but also a place of growth, learning, and resilience. Every challenge, every brush with danger, had shaped him into someone who could endure, survive, and even thrive in this harsh, beautiful land. In the following weeks, Ethan continued to refine his skills, always with Silas's guidance but increasingly on his own. He became known as a reliable presence in Dry Creek, someone who could be trusted to help in difficult situations, and who moved with quiet confidence across the plains. The town, once wary of outsiders, began to see him as a protector, a young man who had grown through experience, patience, and courage. Ethan also began to reflect on what it meant to truly survive in the Wild West. He understood that it was not enough to avoid danger or act with skill. True survival required mental strength, awareness, and endurance. It required the ability to stay calm, to observe, and to make decisions with a clear mind. The mantra Silas had repeated so often, "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out," had become a part of him, guiding his actions and shaping his perspective on life. One day, as Ethan rode alone across the plains, he came to a quiet stream where he often rested. He dismounted, letting his horse drink, and sat by the water's edge. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from a nervous drifter unsure of his place in the world to a young man capable of facing danger and making thoughtful, strategic decisions. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth, and Ethan felt a deep connection to the land around him. He knew that challenges would continue to come: storms, outlaws, accidents, and unforeseen dangers. But he also knew that he was ready. Every lesson, every brush with danger, and every moment of observation and patience had prepared him for whatever lay ahead. He was no longer just surviving. He was thriving in a way he had never imagined possible. Returning to Dry Creek, Ethan found the town bustling with life. Merchants unloaded goods, children played in the dusty streets, and townspeople moved with purpose and determination. The town felt alive, resilient, and full of possibility. Ethan realized that he had become part of that resilience, a symbol of what could be achieved through patience, awareness, and endurance. That evening, as the sun set and painted the town in golden light, Silas approached Ethan. "You've grown," he said simply. "Not just in skill, but in understanding. You know what it takes to survive, and you've proven yourself. But remember, the West always has another challenge. Stay steady, keep your eyes open, and never forget what you've learned." Ethan nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Silas had been more than a mentor. He had been a guide, teaching him the skills, patience, and endurance needed to navigate a dangerous and unpredictable world. The lessons would stay with him forever, shaping every decision and every breath he took. As night fell over Dry Creek, Ethan sat outside the saloon, looking at the stars scattered across the endless sky. The town was quiet, but the air carried the promise of new challenges and adventures. Ethan understood now that survival was a journey, not a destination. Every moment mattered, every decision shaped the future, and every breath was a chance to endure. He thought back on the words that had guided him from the beginning. "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out." Those words were no longer just advice, they were a way of life. Ethan Parker had faced danger, learned the rules of the Wild West, and emerged stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. The wind whispered through the town, carrying the stories of the past and the promise of the future. Ethan mounted his horse, feeling the rhythm of its hooves beneath him, and rode toward the horizon. The plains stretched endlessly, full of possibilities, dangers, and lessons waiting to be learned. He was no longer just a boy from nowhere. He was a young man shaped by the Wild West, capable of facing whatever challenges lay ahead. As he rode, the memory of Silas's voice echoed in his mind, steady and unwavering. "You're still breathing. Hold on until your breath runs out." Ethan smiled faintly, feeling the strength and resilience that came from truly understanding those words. The journey was far from over, but he knew that he was ready. The Wild West was vast, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but Ethan Parker had learned its rhythm. He had learned patience, observation, endurance, and courage. He had faced danger, survived, and grown. And as he rode into the endless plains, he carried with him the knowledge that true survival was not about avoiding danger, but about facing it, staying calm, and holding on until the very end. And in that moment, under the vast sky and the endless horizon, Ethan understood the true meaning of life in the West: to endure, to survive, and to keep moving forward, no matter what came next.